Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Spectrum Part 4, where we talk about mood disorders, or as I'm calling them, mood response patterns. The term disorder has a lot of negativity associated with it. It's often a label. It's not really great to label people as being one monolithic thing when we are, of course, multifaceted creatures. Hello, my name is Jesse. Welcome to the channel Open Source Owners, where we talk about what would it be like if humans had an owner's manual. So mood disorders or response patterns are different and of a different kind than the first three parts of this video series where we talked about personality disorders, right? Or personality response patterns. Now, personality response patterns really come from these core wounds at an early childhood and a developmental age, connected through attachment theory and attachment styles, as we've talked about. Mood disorders as well, of course, are connected to attachment styles because everything is connected to our attachment formations at an early age. But this is a clear distinction here. Mood disorders respond to biological treatments, and we'll talk more about that at the next slide, than personality disorders will. In other words, and we'll talk about this, I believe, and I think that there's enough evidence for me to state this, that mood disorders can be sort of resolved primarily focusing on the biological aspect. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have to focus on trauma or attachment or the social interaction or the spiritual dimensions of things. Those things all count. But mood disorders and anxiety disorders respond really well to biological treatment, where personality disorders, they will not get harmed by biological treatments, but they will not resolve the root issue of a personality disorder. Okay, so with that said, there are only 4 mood disorders. They are major depressive disorder, MDD. I'm sure some of you have had this. Data on depression is pretty staggering. 500 million people worldwide suffer with depression in any given year. So it's a very common feature of the human experience. So this should, I left out a lot of information because this is probably fairly familiar to most people. It involves long periods of extreme sadness, hopelessness, and or fatigue that last for 2 or more weeks. And often involves low sex drive, low appetite, low interest in things. And I should say here, we should try to parse out whether you're experiencing profound grief or you're experiencing profound depression. And those two things can interplay with each other. But if somebody just lost a loved one, then it is perfectly natural, it is perfectly part of the process of grief to go through long periods of sadness, hopelessness, low sex drive, low appetite, low mood, all that sort of stuff. So it really depends on, you know, how we're defining things, I guess. But I just want to keep in mind that there are 2 sort of separate things. There's depression, which is sort of long-term, pervasive, persistent. You're not really having an obvious origin. If you said, what caused your depression to somebody with major depressive disorder, they would not have a simple cause. It would be like, I don't know. I've struggled with this for years. Like, what are you talking about? There's not one thing. Whereas with somebody who's experiencing the depression phase of grief, you know, you could say, well, what's going on? What's caused this? Or when did this begin? And they would very clearly say, well, after the loss of my loved one, or after the profound change in this aspect of my life, I've experienced depression. One, you want to treat with grief counseling, understanding grief, allowing grief to be a process that you engage with in a healthy way. The other, you want to work on the biological foci that we're going to talk about here in a second, as well as making sure to address any trauma or PTSD history or neglect history. So that's MDD. This is the number 1 most common diagnoses that we see at the hospital where I work with clinically depressed and anxious clients. This is number 1. Now, that may just be an easy placeholder for insurances because often there's more complex ideologies behind these things. But this is the most common diagnoses that we have, and the second being generalized anxiety disorder, which we'll talk about in part 5 of this video series. All right, what's the next mood disorder? Well, it is bipolar 1 disorder or bipolar response patterns, right? Now, this is classic manic depression, like Jimi Hendrix sang a song about. This is typified by long periods of mania and long periods of depression. So you oscillate between these 2 cycles. Usually the manic phase is shorter and the depressive phase is longer. The manic phase is very intense. You experience extreme euphoria, extreme irritability, and often it's associated with increased energy and activity. During manic episodes, you may also regularly engage yourself in activities that can, never mind that word very, that can result in painful consequences for you and someone else. So it has consequences. Often you'll hear about people like losing their mind or getting into a manic phase and going and gambling or selling their house or selling their car or moving the family. Those are typical things you hear under a true full manic phase. I've worked with people in the psychiatric unit where when they're in mania, they believe that they talk to God directly and Jesus directly, and they know Kanye West personally, and they got a record deal in LA just waiting for him. Lots of just sort of big ideas that are not moored or tied into really like fundamental reality at all. So bipolar 1 is really typified by full-on mania and full-on depression. The manic phase can be really intoxicating and fun to be around. To a degree, it can also be very damaging. The depression phase is horrible. It's the deepest, darkest depression you could ever have. And bipolar 2 is the next one. Bipolar 2 disorder or response patterns. You must have had at least one episode of current or past hypomania. Now, hypo just means under. Think about like a hypodermic needle. It goes under the epidermis. So hypo meaning lower than normal mania, lower than a full-blown manic episode. And at least one episode of current or past major depression. So, but you cannot have a history of the manic episode, the full-on manic episode. So that's it. I mean, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 are very similar. One is just less intense in its manic phase than the other, essentially. I mean, I'm leaving out details, of course, but that's one way you can think about both bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. They both kind of have a similar presentation and a similar destructive quality to one's life. But obviously bipolar 1 is just more extreme in that way. And then there is seasonal affective disorder, SAD. I love that acronym, right? It's like, oh, you're sad? Maybe you have SAD. Anyway, this type of depression obviously is typically connected to shortening of the day. So where I live in Michigan, people get seasonal depression around, like maybe after the holidays, January, February, March. The light is lower. We just are outside less because it's cold, and we can have what's called seasonal affective disorder. And those are the 4 mood disorders. I mean, that's it. Generalized anxiety falls into an anxiety disorder, and we'll talk about that in the next series. And then there's also psychotic disorders that I want to touch on, like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And we'll touch on those 2 briefly, and then we'll be done with this whole mental health spectrum arc that we're doing here. Okay, so this is something that I don't feel like is very well known in the mental health space. When I would say things like this to my clients and show them books that indicate this, and you, by all means, if you want to check out the books that I suggest for this, click the link below. There's a book recommendation list. Check that out. That's where I get most of this information. I'm not citing things very regularly because it takes a lot more work, and most of my stuff is not from particular studies. It's from books, which bring in a lot of different studies, but have a bit of maybe a POV. Books often have a point of view, and then they use science to sort of support their arguments. So anyway, people have found this to be surprising, and it is always my hope that they find it to be hopeful. And we'll talk a lot more about this on this channel because this whole biological aspect of being a human is so critical. So mood disorders respond very well to biological root cause analysis, unlike personality disorders. And you could also say anxiety disorders respond well to root cause analysis too, unlike personality disorders. So the treatment, how we treat these things, begins to branch off. And what I would like to see psychiatry and psychology move into is a much more thorough understanding of the biological systems. And by that, I mean nutrition and nutrient therapy. So it is well known in at least some of the functional medicine spaces that I pay attention to, or maybe some like integrative medicine doctors or naturopathic doctors, that deficiency in vitamin B12 and a deficiency in vitamin D, both those 2, are highly correlated with depression. You could spend years and years talking to your therapist and talking about your family and your trauma and your neglect and your abuse and all that sort of stuff, but never will you uncover through talk therapy alone that you have a vitamin B12 deficiency and you have since birth, right? And maybe it's a genetic predisposition, and that's an epigenetic phenomenon. That's a whole other conversation. But maybe it's like some part of you, it's just like, it's going to be really hard for you to make those levels of D and B12 that you need. What are the presentations of low B12 and D? Low depression, low appetite, anhedonia, lack of a sex drive, sleeping a lot, you know, cold hands, cold feet. I mean, it can present just like depression does. How will we know if it's biological origin mostly or psychological origin mostly unless we test that? And so root cause analysis is sort of like work with a great functional medicine doctor, get some basic tests that look not just at like baseline levels of nutrients, but like optimum levels. Where do you want to be? Where does the science say humans thrive, cells thrive, mitochondria thrive at these levels? Often if you get a blood test from your PCP, your primary care physician, it's just making sure that you don't have too low of numbers so that you're not developing like scurvy or rickets or something like that, right? They're keeping you out of the danger zone, but they're not necessarily putting you into the optimum zone. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. By way of nutrient therapy, I just want to highlight the fact that there's a book called This Is Your Brain on Food, which was written by what's called a nutritional psychiatrist working out of Harvard. Did you know there's such a thing as nutritional psychiatry? I didn't until I read that book, and I'm so happy that it exists. So this psychiatrist can prescribe all the normal meds, but they're also educated in nutrients and basic sort of like root cause biological health. Okay, next, exercise and movement practices. People with mood disorders often respond really, really well to, every other day or 3 times a week, basic exercise or movement practices. The one that I suggest the highest is just walking. Walking is really great for brain synthesis and brain wholeness. So each hemisphere is working together, and the corpus callosum, the thing in the middle, actually has to coordinate a lot of sophisticated activity between the brain, which is just generally good to stave off the sort of cyclical brain patterns we can get in when we have depression. But also exercise involves all sorts of beneficial things, including helping move your lymphatic fluid out of your body, basically detoxing you more regularly. If you're just laying, if you're just sitting, you're going to have a lot of cellular debris and other biological debris in your body that basically is an inflammation source, which we don't want. You're going to improve your vitamin D levels, you're going to improve your breathing, you're going to improve your oxygen levels, on and on and on. Exercise and or movement practices. People with mood disorders can often really, really move the needle on their mood and their mood disorder with just nutrition and exercise alone. Just that. No psychiatric medication necessarily, no deep talk therapy talking about mom or dad or anything like that. Just focusing on these 2 aspects can move the needle with mood disorders. Sunlight exposure. Making sure that you get early morning sunlight and as much as you can into your eye and onto your skin. Making sure that you're eliminating blue light or reducing blue light from screens and whatnot, and which is covered by sleep stabilization. So really honing in on quality sleep. If you click on the link below that has all my book listings in there, there are 2 or 3 in there that I highly recommend for sleep in particular. So if you're interested in that piece, by all means, please do. Spiritual development and purpose. Often it's not that you were abused or neglected necessarily. It's that you feel you lost your purpose, or maybe you never had a purpose, or you feel like life is meaningless. And spiritual development is the way to like boost this part of your reality. It's the way to upgrade your health and your mood disorders if they're driven at all by a spiritual sort of ennui. I keep saying ennui in my videos. It's a fun word. It's hard to spell. There's like 2 N's in it or something. Anyway, spiritual development is another aspect of regulating and ultimately resolving at a root cause level mood disorders. And it's a piece that's not to be forgotten about. Lastly, I say here, identifying personal kryptonite, which we'll get into in a second. But kryptonite is I think, fake mineral, or maybe it's a real mineral, but used in the Superman story. Remember Superman, who could fly and shoot laser beams out of his eyes and spin the planet in the other direction and all that sort of stuff? Well, his one weakness was kryptonite, right? So if you could get that mineral or rock next to Superman, it would take his powers away. And we all have our own kryptonites, and they're very unique and they're very particular to our biology, to our history, to our worldview, to our spiritual moorings or not, etc. So we need to begin to identify those, and mood disorders respond really well when we can actually begin to really hone in on what's causing us inflammation, what's causing us biological stress. So in the psychological domains, trauma, neglect, PTSD, we have to address those wounds. I tell my clients all the time, when you're stable and when you're able, address the trauma as soon as possible. Address PTSD, CPTSD, ASAP, as soon as you possibly can, because that's like having a neck wound, like a mortal wound, but also having a broken toe. What do you address first, the broken toe or the mortal wound? Well, same thing here. We have to address the biggest sort of elephant in the room, the thing that's driving the whole biological system to work harder and to be stressed out and to be overwhelmed, is often in that psychological domain. Now, many people with depression, though, are like, I had a decent childhood, I wasn't abused, I didn't have neglect, I don't have PTSD, what's going on? Well, then it's those first 4 things, and then also identifying these next several. Certain foods can be a trigger for you and nobody else. The only way to really know this is to play around with elimination diets and really see. You can also get testing and to see what foods you're allergic to. And some of the genetic testing is pretty sophisticated at this point. Certain poisons in the home and the body or the atmosphere. Maybe you live in a house with black mold. Black mold, some people respond really, really strongly to black mold. Other people, maybe not so much. Maybe your body has some type of like toxic element in it, like your mercury fillings are interfering with your biological functioning. Or maybe you have certain foods that you're eating that are acting as poisons to your microbiome. And you don't realize that until you go through this process. The atmosphere, it could be, you're living next to a factory that's putting out a bunch of like lead-laden air, or maybe you're super sensitive to electronic fields and you live right next to a power line or something like that, right? But it's going to be unique to you. It's going to be something that you'll have to sort of systematically go through and figure out, okay, what kind of lifestyle do I have to live to make sure I'm protected? And it's not going to be ubiquitous. It's going to be very individualized. And of course, certain relationship dynamics or attachments, or maybe you're in an abusive relationship, of course, those things are going to affect your mood, and they're going to basically look like clinical depression, but maybe it's you live with an abusive person, or you live in a very controlling environment and your relationships are toxic in that way. Okay, so that is all I wanted to say about mood disorders. We will go through things like nutrition and exercise and sunlight and spiritual development and all these things in other videos in the future. That's what this channel is focused on. But for now, I just wanted to highlight that mood disorders respond really well to these biological sort of root cause analyses, treatment models. Much better often than antidepressants, or much better than just talk therapy alone. When it comes to treatment, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a great therapy. Have a round of CBT while you're doing these things, and that'll sort of clear up the headspace. Make sure that you're not being too toxic mentally and you're starting to catch yourself. CBT is great, and you don't have to do CBT forever. You can just do 6 weeks of it or 9 weeks of it with a really good CBT trained therapist. And then you kind of know the skills, and then it's very homework based. It's like practice this, journal this, observe when you engage in distorted thinking, how it affects your mood. So CBT is, I think, just generally speaking, something everybody should have a round in or should know at least a little bit about. But still, CBT is still kind of gold standard treatment in terms of the talk therapy, psychotherapy space for mood disorders. So if you have clinical depression, CBT is going to be very helpful. CBT will not address bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. It's not really going to help that much. In fact, all of these are so driven by the chemical and the nutrient and the hormonal changes in our body that is the way that I would address it. If you have bipolar and you're looking for what exactly do I do for bipolar, that book I mentioned earlier, This Is Your Brain on Food, has a chapter on bipolar. Also, Dr. William Walsh has a book called Nutrient Power, which is also in that link below if you click it. But that book particularly talks about really cutting edge biological treatments for bipolar. He's had a lot of success with things like schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder and bipolar using nutrients and basically biological therapy. All right, so that is it for mood disorders. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you haven't gotten your free 60-page ebook, download it now. It's in the link below. Just click it. It's yours. It'll come right to your email. That was the Mental Health Spectrum Part 4, Mood Disorders, or as I call them, Mood Response Patterns. Why do we have these disorders? It's not just you're disordered. That's just a label. It doesn't help. The question is, why do we have the disorders? In other words, what is our body, in its infinite wisdom, responding to in a way that gives us depression or bipolar or seasonal affective disorder? There must be some pattern. Things don't just happen randomly. I mean, there are random occurrences, but things like mood disorders and anxiety disorders, those have drivers. There's something driving those systems. And unfortunately, because it's a complex world, there may be many things driving them, so we have to spend some time experimenting. But again, I find so many clients of mine don't even realize that there's this whole bucket of treatment possibilities called the biological domain, whether you work with naturopaths or whether you work with just exercise and lifestyle factors, or whether you work with functional medicine doctors. You can get a lot of leverage out of that. So just keep that in mind. Share this video with people who you know who struggle with mood disorders, because it literally might be maybe not life-saving, but it's like life-altering. Like this type of information, if acted upon, could free somebody from their mood disorders more or less permanently, as long as they keep up on those lifestyle factors going forward, right? Thanks everybody for making it this far in the video. I appreciate it. I hope that you found this interesting. Please like the channel, please subscribe, and most importantly, comment. Have you suffered with mood disorders over your lifetime? Have you noticed anything that has helped those mood disorders? Have you known anybody who's recovered from mood disorders? How did they do it? What do you think about this biological domain? Is that new to you? Is that old news to you? Tell us about it in the comments below. I will read everyone. Thank you guys so much. I'll talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.